Welcome. It's time again for our Zoom chats with the Pocono Liars Club. And this week we have a great guest, Jon McGoran. Hello, Jon. How are you?
Hey, Michael. Glad to be here.
I'm glad to
Doing
see
well.
you. We're going to start by having you introduce yourself because whenever I introduce, I always leave stuff out. So please introduce yourself to everybody.
Well, let's see. So my name is Jon McGoran. I'm the author of 10 novels for adults and young adults. I started out with a trilogy of forensic thrillers with Berkeley Penguin, I guess about 14 years ago now. And then I had another trilogy of science thrillers with Tor Forge I kind of pitched them as Michael Pollan meets Michael Crichton, kind of science thrillers about food and biotech and all that sort of stuff. I've done a bunch of short stories, and I also did a media tie-in novel called The Dead Ring, based on the TV show The Blacklist. And then a few years ago, I dipped my toe into the waters of young adult with the first book in a trilogy, Spliced, which came out, I guess, 3 years ago. The sequel, Spiked, came out last year, just came out in paperback. Splintered is the sequel, which came out in paperback. And then Spiked is the third and final book in the trilogy, which just came out in May. I am a kind of founding member of the Liars Club. It was one of the original four. I am a co-host of the Liars Club Oddcast, along with Greg Frost and Kelly Simmons and Keith Strunk and Mary Jones. I do developmental editing, work with a bunch of other writers and coaching, an adjunct in Drexel's MFA program, and I was a coach at Wharton in a writing program they had. The last couple of years, I've been doing a lot more screenwriting, which nothing has really happened with that, officially. A couple of very exciting nibbles that never went anywhere. I was repped by ICM, and now my agents at ICM moved to Gotham, and they're shopping several things right now, including a TV series based on the Splice series. I live right outside of Philadelphia with my wife, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, welcome along. Let's talk a little bit and make sure we have our terms set. When we're talking about young adult, which is our topic for today, how do you distinguish young adult from middle grade, picture book, adult books? Is there an age group that usually you're aiming for with that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, there doesn't seem to be a really, really official hard and fast rule. And there are, kind of younger young adult and older young adult. There's the category that the books are pitched under and that they're shelved by. But within that, there's a range. These books, so case in point, these books, my print publisher aged them at 14 and up, and my audiobook publisher, the audiobook publisher of the first one, aged them at 12 to 17. Some of the different publishing houses have different criteria on their own. I talked to them about that. Like, why is there this difference? Do you just kind of perceive it as one says, oh no, I think kids a couple of years younger. No. That's just the categories that they have set up. So middle grade is younger than that. I do think that, and then there's also this new adult, which is this kind of weird quasi category genre that I think in my experience really only kind of exists in the minds of people who talk about these things, because I haven't actually seen any of those. And nobody seems to know really what it is. And I think originally it was supposed to be this kind of bridge category between young adult and adult, but it really, I think it ended up being this kind of younger version of women's contemporary fiction, or kind of the successor to chick lit, when that kind of went by the wayside and stopped being really a thing. So I think it's, there's not a hard and fast rule, long story short. Middle grade is younger. And then, there's chapter books and all that. I'm still kind of trying to get that stuff. And I've actually considered, my publisher really wants me to, and my wife, who's a children's librarian, is, encouraging me to dip my toe into middle grade. And I'm thinking about it. I have some ideas for books that I would really like to read. And there's some great stuff in the middle grade. My sense of it is I think that there's a much bigger jump from young adult to middle grade than there is from adult to young adult.
And a young adult, what makes a young adult novel? Is it just the age of the protagonist, or is it more the topics? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like there's no hard and fast rules. I think there's,
right.
Maybe some people do have some, ideas in mind. None of them are authoritative. There are a couple of, it's like with genres, there are certain kind of marks you're expected to hit. Some genres are a little more kind of structured in that regard. Cozies and romance tend to be more, formulaic in
Yes.
there are anticipations of things that you're going to do. And if you don't, it's not considered really, part of the genre.
But you really couldn't have a young adult novel with an adult as the main character, could you?
I don't think you could. No. And, and that's one of the interesting things also, there are a lot of adult novels with adolescent protagonists. I think generally they tend to be written from the point of view of that protagonist as an adult. So it's past tense looking back. Whereas in young adult, it really should be, at eye level. It should the point of view should be young adult. And one of the things, for me, I did kind of worry about that. Like, and the other thing is, there really is an expectation of that all of the main characters or the main characters will predominantly be adolescents. There is room for adults. There's adults in the world. But, if you rely too heavily on them as characters, you will probably start to get pushback from agents or editors and readers who expect something different.
There also seems to be a lot of young adult novels nowadays that tend to be written in present tense.
Yeah, there are.
Have you found that to be a good thing?
Well, it does lend itself to certain things. So I do a lot of developmental editing, and I've edited a few books in present tense. And it is interesting. One of the things that I definitely noticed, definitely, is people slip out of it. Which, there's all sorts of things that happen that mistakes or whatever that are removed on the path to publication. But that's definitely one of them. I don't think I've ever edited a present tense book that didn't fall into past tense inappropriately at some point or another. I think that there are some. I have not done it. It really does lend an air of immediacy, though. I mean, it draws you in, and it is effective in that regard. Maybe I don't know if I would try it at any point. But it is, a lot more and more people are experimenting with it. I've actually read some, I forget who it was, but it was second person present tense.
Oh, okay.
And it was like, for me, it was like, I felt as though I was being bossed around the entire time. You're doing this, you're doing that, you're doing this, you're doing that. It's like, no, I'm not, I don't want to. I want to do what I want to do.
Sounds like those choose your own adventure books.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Are there any other requirements when you're writing a young adult novel? For example, considering things like violence, sex, language, things like that. There are considerations,
and I think that, if you carpet bomb your manuscript with F-bombs, or if the sex is very explicit, or if the violence is really explicit, or, there's all sorts of things that, there's no rule that you can't do it, but you're going to close off markets and you're going to close off readers, and you might attract others. So it's a trade-off, I do think that, a lot of people, case in point, there are things like Scholastic. Scholastic will distribute YA, and it's a big market. I was not selected for it. God damn it. But there you go. But that's one of those things that if you cross some of these lines, or not cross them because they're not lines per se, but if you go in certain directions, you are going to close off certain avenues, to yourself. We had Barry Liga came on the Oddcast, I guess last year, and he writes stuff about serial killers, and it's dark, edgy stuff, and and he's like, well, some people aren't going to like it, and some people are. Really, in a lot of ways, one of the things that's really attractive about writing young adult is that you can play around with genre. You can do, in a lot of ways, you have more freedom to play around with stuff and to, with conventions than you do in a lot of adult genre fiction.
Did you find yourself censoring yourself during this trilogy at all?
A little bit. There was one, I think, Splintered. I finished the manuscript, and there was one F-bomb, and I was like, well, and really, it wasn't, for me, it ended up being, if there were 20, it would have been fine, but just having one, it was really jarring. On the
other hand, that may make it more powerful too if you just use
yes. It. It was kind of a comedic moment.
Okay.
So it didn't need that kind of power. I do think that it was funnier with it, but it just seemed like it wasn't worth it. It was kind of 6 of one, half a dozen the other. But I thought about it for a long time. I think we were pretty late in the I think we were in past copy edits when I finally decided I'm just going to take it out. Take the path of least resistance. It wasn't. And my publisher was totally cool about it. They were like, hey, it's totally up to you, however you want to go. But is it worth whatever hassle might because there's like school libraries and school markets, stuff like that, where it's consideration. It is.
Do you think that romance needs to be in a young adult? Do young adults like to read romance stories? And is that another touchy subject you have to be careful of?
It can be. You have to handle it carefully. And again, I think that it's the kind of thing that really you can do that. You do whatever the hell you want. You might, if you go too far, you might not find a publisher. If you go, not quite so far, but you decide that you really want it to be fairly explicit, that's important to the story and important to, the integrity of the book. You might get a publisher, but, you might end up off of the school reading lists or the libraries or, whatever. So there really is, there's a, the lines are not so hard and fast. It's not like there are a set of rules that you have to abide by, but all of these decisions have consequences. And
a couple of people have pointed out a couple of variations, if I can.
Sure.
Marianne points out that the Earthsea trilogy by Ursula Quinn has an adult protagonist, but you usually find it in the young adult section. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I don't know.
Are you familiar with that series?
I haven't read it. Okay. I'm familiar with it, but I've seen a lot of books over the last couple of years. Fran Wild's the Updraft was. It reads very much like a YA, and I think she won the the Andre Norton Prize, which is for young adult. Right. But it was not marketed as young adult. It was not positioned as young adult. It was just science fiction or general fiction or fantasy or whatever. So, sometimes the publisher just decides to do things in a certain way because who the hell knows? I mean, maybe they had a full slate of YA that year, or maybe they just thought it was too mature. I think the subsequent books they did sell as young adult. I've seen a few other books that felt very much like YA. And it could be that the publisher said, oh, well, you know what, there's too many adult characters, or, there is too much sex or violence, or, adult themes or whatever. And they decided, to change the positioning of it, the marketing.
Because a lot of this is aiming for the market, aiming for this, it's not necessarily the category. More important is how are we going to sell it, as opposed to what it really is.
And that's so much of what genre is. It's like my stuff really tends to, I do, it's like people are like, oh, well, I describe these books as, near future young adult science fiction thrillers, with romance and mystery, and there's no westerns but no horror, but it's like pretty much all the genres wrapped up in one, and I like that. I like a lot of mystery in my thrillers. I like a lot of thrills in my mystery. I like a lot of science and all the stuff. And as I said before, the young adult is a great place for kind of blurring those lines, because a lot of it just ends up young adult. But a lot of, when you're going out to market, when you're starting to pitch to query agents or editors with a book, and if you don't clearly adhere to one genre or another, you can tell them, oh, it's near future young adult science fiction thriller, but they're going to have to decide if they're going to pitch it as young adult, or thriller, or science fiction, or whatever. And same thing with mystery and thriller. There's a lot of overlap, but if you're going to pitch a book as a mystery, then you're going to get notes back saying, oh, you want to kind of steer it in this direction because it's supposed to be a mystery. And if you're pitching it as a thriller, then you're going to get notes, saying, oh, you need to lean this way because it's supposed to be a thriller. So those decisions can, they can have big implications. I mean, it's, obviously it's important to how it's marketed. It's important to where it's shelved, or, categorized online or whatever. But, if you decide that it's this thing and it's not hitting all the marks for this thing, you're going to get pushed in that direction.
Someone else pointed out that it's not just the age of the character, because they pointed out Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, where underage heroine, but it certainly doesn't seem like a young adult novel. You wouldn't consider that a young adult novel, would you?
No, certainly not. Certainly not. And, I mean, the fact of the matter is also that all the other characters are adults, I believe. So, there is this young adult character, but in this adult milieu. But, right, a lot of it's about tone and theme and voice.
Now, your main character, you wrote a young girl is your main character.
Yep.
Do you think that makes it different how you write? Do you write a book with a female main character differently from you'd write it with a male main character?
Absolutely. Well, so let me say this. All characters are different. Whoever. So it's also written in first person. Mm-hmm. For me, the protagonist was incredibly important. Her voice was incredibly important, because she kind of, I kind of put myself in her hands as far as writing young adult. I was nervous about whether I would be able to adjust my voice and my tone and to write young adult convincingly. And what I realized was that I had to, I mean, we can talk about this a little more. People, my friends tease me sometimes because I talk about outlining a lot, but outlining is a hugely important part of my process. And it's hugely important for plot, which I think is very important. I'm very plot driven, but nothing's more important than character. And for me, one of the huge benefits of outlining is that before I sit down to start writing the first draft, I've been thinking in terms of these characters for so long, really getting to know them, getting to know what they would do and wouldn't do, how they would react, that I feel like I know them really well. And if I don't, then I don't start writing yet. So I think some writers kind of get to know the character as they're writing that first draft, and then they'll kind of go back and rewrite the beginning and kind of make it more cohesive or true to the character. But for me, and especially for this series, my thinking was that if I can get to know Jimmy really well, and I'm writing in her voice, that her voice, as an adolescent, her voice will make it young adult. If I can just kind of, that was my North Star, that if I could just like keep my eye, stay true to her voice, stay true to her character, then I'd be in good shape. And I think it worked out pretty well.
I enjoyed it. Of course, I haven't read the newest one. I haven't read the newest one yet. Please forgive me for that.
That's okay. You're in good company.
Well, it just came out. I see this. Do you think? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. When you were putting this together and pitching it to an agent, did you have to have the entire series planned out in advance? I mean, did they want to know that you're going to have sequels to it?
They wanted to know. It was a 1-book deal. But and I'm trying to remember when they asked.
Before it was published or after it was published?
Before it was published.
Mm-hmm.
Before it was published, for sure. But while we were in the editing process, and my editor loved it, and she wanted a trilogy. So she wanted to know, what ideas I had. I remember when I wrote the Doyle Carrick books, the Drift and Dead Out and Dust Up,
the thrillers. Yes.
I remember getting a call from my agent that we had a publisher. We actually ended up with 3 publishers making offers on it. But she said, okay, I remember this. So it was like a Thursday night, and she said, okay, we've got a couple of publishers interested in one, I think we're going to go with. We'll see how it goes. But they wanted a list of comps. They wanted a list of people that I might be able to get blurbs from, and they wanted a list of sequel ideas. And I was like, oh, great, sure, yeah, I can do that. And like, okay, well, tomorrow morning.
Of course.
Yeah. So I stayed up all night that night, and and I already had some ideas on sequels for that. But it's the same thing with this. I in writing the first book, I had ideas for the second 2. So I think it was while we were, I think it was before copy edits that they, the thing is with the production schedule is so long. The delay in getting a book out is so long that if you want a book to come out, at a normal pace, you really have to start working on the sequels well before the book comes out, or else it's just going to be, 2 years or 2.5 years, 3 years. So,
well, let's talk about pitching, if you don't mind, because
sure,
obviously
yeah.
that's what we all care about. If we're trying to pitch a young adult novel to an agent or an editor, is it important in the query letter to say, by the way, here's some ideas for sequels, or should you not even mention that?
I think that it's a good idea to mention that you see it as a possible series, or that you see it as the first book in a trilogy. I would say probably keep it open and just say you see it as as a series.
It would be a bad idea to end your first book on a cliffhanger, so they'd have to be a second book. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it's up to you. I think that it's a chance you take.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, some books are clearly standalones,
Mm-hmm.
and some books are clearly the first book or are part of a series. And then I think a lot of books could go either way, and up until that last chapter, it could go either way. So I think that if an agent or an editor is reading your book and they're totally pulled in, and then they get to the end and they're like, I really hoped that there would be room for a sequel, or I was really hoping this would be a standalone, I don't want a cliffhanger. They're not going to say no to the book. They're going to say, we see this as the first book in the series. Could you rewrite the ending? or vice versa. We see it as a standalone. Can you make it more self-contained? I don't think that's going to cost you the deal. If they're still into it by the time they get to the end, you're on board. Because the thing is, they're going to edit it. They're going to edit it.
If you got them reading all the way to the end, you probably made a sale.
You're in good shape. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk a little about
the other thing I will say is that I think it's very important. You don't want to lay it on too thick about the sequels. Because apart from anything else, it shows your hand that you're an amateur. If you're revealing to them, oh, I've already written 5 books in this series, sequels to a book that is not published and may never get published, it just, I don't know. I think it does kind of, it connotes a certain amateurishness.
Which leads me to talk about length, which is something I was going to ask you about. When I first wrote my first novel, I had no idea. I knew nothing, and I was stupid. And I wrote a 140,000 word young adult novel, which was way too long, and nobody picked it up until a small publisher picked it up. What kind of length do young adult novels normally have, and what should people be aiming for?
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten a lot of conflicting advice on this, and people. Clients have asked me about this, and it varies over time. Publishers have different things that they might be wanting at a given moment. I think that if you get up to 100,000 words, you're gonna probably some potentially interested editors or agents might start peeling off because they think, oh, that's going to be a tougher sell. Or they might just say, yeah, I think this is great, but you need to get it down to 80 or something like that, or 90. I think, I have seen books as low as 60. I think probably 70 to 85 or 90 is probably the sweet spot for the most part. Fantasy, and fantasy is hugely popular in YA, and that can go longer. Definitely, if you write that first book and it's 75,000 words or whatever, right in there, and everybody loves it, and then you come in at 140 for the next one. If the first one's successful, no one's going to bat an eye.
Right. Use Harry Potter as an example.
Exactly. That's the example. Yep. I mean, that was very successful.
Yeah.
So,
that was probably the most successful YA book. Which other ones do you think people should read to get an idea of what YA books are like? Would you recommend?
Well, I thought the Hunger Games trilogy was great, and that was, those books really kind of opened my eyes to to the idea that I might want to write YA. I'm a big fan. There's a writer, Paolo Bacigalupi,
Yes.
who I think he's a really talented writer, and
I didn't think of his as young adult.
So the Shipbreaker series is.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was.
Yeah, and it was really good.
Yeah.
I forget what the question was. I forget why I brought him up.
We were talking about good examples of young adult novels to read.
Yeah. I think the Rotten Ruins. I think Mayberry does a great job with the Rotten Ruin books.
Mm-hmm.
I think that let's see, what else is really. I think the Barry Lyga books are really good. Robin Benway, I think, is a really talented writer. She won we had her on the podcast a couple months ago, and she's lovely. I met her at a book festival, the Rochester Teen Book Festival, and she has a book, Far from the Tree, which is it's not genre, it's just kind of contemporary realist. But it's lovely. I think she does a great job with that. And again, in a lot of these books, they're very accessible to adults. They're just really well written.
Oh yeah.
And I think there are some things, it's like there were some things that I altered in, apart from just kind of trusting myself to my protagonist voice. I did kind of, try to lean away from too much in the way of, elaborate sentence structures and stuff like that, which I think is probably, in thrillers, you probably don't want to do that anyway. And it's something that I kind of tend to do, which I then, kind of fix and rewrite. But I was a little more mindful of that. But I mean, I think that a lot of this, and again, and there are these other, and I'm blanking on any examples, but there are these kind of young adult books, which really are borderline middle grade. I mean, they're in the young adult section, and they're marketed as young adult, but it's very young adult.
They tend to be much shorter too, like 40,000 or so words.
Yeah.
What,
middle grade or young adult?
I've seen, maybe that is middle grade. Maybe we.
Yeah, it might be. It might be. Yeah. Again, it's.
There's no law that says it has to be a certain thing. Yeah. Do you think it's important for young adult novels to have lessons for young adults? Do you think it's important that there's like a moral, or there's a theme that young adults should learn, if you know what I'm saying?
No.
That you would not necessarily put in an adult book, is what I'm trying to say. But
I don't think so. I mean, I think that any well-written book is going to have, lessons. I think that we as writers, the most important thing that we're doing, and I think the most compelling thing, as I said, I'm a plot guy. Most of my ideas, my kind of the development of my ideas, it starts with like a kernel of an idea, a notion. In Spliced, it was, what happens several decades from now. Genetic engineering technology has matured to the point where it's available on the street as a form of body modification. Mm-hmm. That's my starting point. I blow the idea up from there, kind of expand in all these different directions, figure out what would happen, like what might the backbone of the plot be, and then who would be involved in that kind of story. Who would do these things? Who would have these things done to them? Who would react in the ways that the plot kind of requires? But then I spent a long time fleshing those characters out and really kind of getting to know them. And yeah, a lot of times, the characters will change the plot. Absolutely. But I think that if you take your characters and your characterizations seriously, and if you kind of do the work for, in point of view and that sort of thing, to really put the reader inside the head and kind of make this, magical empathetic thing happen where you take a person out of their head and put them in somebody else's head, that's big. And that's kind of, if you take somebody out of their head and put them into somebody else's head, they should really learn something about the human condition, just by dint of the fact that you're doing it. For me, it's like I have ideas and issues and themes in my books that are important to them and are important to me. But I think a lot of books don't have that kind of overt aspect. And it's just, they're just a great story. And, it's like, oh, these characters are great and they're really well wrought. And it's just a delight to spend some time in their world, in their heads. Or it's, just like a great plot and an adventure, whatever. There's all sorts of ways a book can be great.
Well, you definitely have that. I know that one of the issues you and I have talked about before is GMOs and things like that. And you certainly worked it into not just this, but the like Dust Up and Dead Out too, have sort of genetic engineering is your, it. So that's why you write about it, I take it. Mm-hmm. And
yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it, but also, so the idea for Spliced came to me while, it came directly from research into Dust Up. Mm-hmm. So I was researching those books, and I, came across this subculture of biohackers, that is this existent subculture, and these kind of, just as kind of not hackers, but people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates in the 70s and 80s were building computers in their garages. There's people doing that with genetic engineering today. And I was like, this is fascinating. It's kind of awesome in a way. I mean, there is this great American tradition of citizen scientists, which I think is just really just fabulous. And it goes back to like the founding fathers, you know, I mean,
Mhm.
Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. But it's also terrifying, you know, so, you know, it's like, well, and, you know, some of these people are you know, government scientists or professors who, you know exactly what they're doing and they just have a side gig. But some of them are just like, oh, you know what, this isn't regulated. I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but what happens if I throw some of this into some of that? You know, what'll happen?
Well, that's one thing I enjoyed about this series was that you talk about the politics of it as well. You know, because it's one thing to talk about the science, but quite often they ignore the politics. And of course, I'm a political guy because all my books have politics in them somewhere. Um, and that's important. I think people sometimes forget to look at the entire society when you're coming up with a what if story.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, for me, you know, it's like I had this nugget of an idea, and I knew that if this was available, if this technology was available in this way, if people could splice themselves with animal genes as a form of body modification, there are those who would do it. You know, it wouldn't be me. You know, I'm a cowardly middle-aged guy. You know, it's I don't have any piercings. I don't have any tattoos. You know, but there would be those who would, and that was part of. You know, I knew that I wanted to write young adult, but when I had this idea, I was like, okay, well, who would do that? And the obvious answer was young people. You know, which I think is true.
Yep.
But then I also, you know, there was this kind of, as is often the case with me, and you know, as I'm kind of fleshing out my story ideas, you know, it's like, okay, well, who would do it? Okay, that's who would do it. Well, why would they do it? And I didn't want it, and I didn't think it would. You know, it's a fairly drastic thing. You know, it's more drastic than a tattoo for sure. So why would someone do that? Well, you know, so I had that simmering on one burner, you know, while I was trying to figure it out. And then on another burner, I was like, well, what is the world in which this takes place? If it was in the, you know, I had already decided that it was going to be, you know, 40, 50, 60 years in the future, you know, in order to give the technology a chance to mature enough to be available on the street. If I didn't incorporate climate change into this book, then I would be abetting those who were denying it. And I couldn't do that, you know, because it's, you know, the biggest thing we're facing. Yeah, right, exactly. But that kind of, you know, so I realized that, you know, I started kind of thinking about how the world would be, you know, what state might the world be in if we continue on this track and we don't do anything or we don't do enough. And one aspect of climate change is mass extinction. So that kind of informed why some people would get spliced as kind of a statement of solidarity with the natural world, or saying I'm not part of this, or an homage to extinct megafauna, or, you know, a way to in some way preserve them by keeping part of their genome going, you know, that sort of thing. But then I also had to think about that's how the world at this moment would impact the people who would do this, but how would they impact that world? How would the world react to them? And you know, this was quite a while ago, but already, you know, I mean, I guess it was, I don't know, 5 years ago or something that I first had the idea and first started, you know, doing the work on it. Maybe even longer, but already, you know, the divisiveness of American politics was, you know, was heating up. There's so much kind of demonization and othering and xenophobia, and, you know, people really kind of, you know, very, very, you know, crassly manipulative, using certain classes of the citizenry as wedge issues. You know, it's like, oh, you know, there's transsexuals in the bathroom, and, you know, all this, like, this stuff, and it's just, you know, really, you know, dividing people, you know, using one small group of people to divide everybody else and to foment hate and try to make political and economic gain from it. So yeah, I mean, the politics was a big part of it. The politics was a very big part of it.
Let me come back to when you were first talking about the book and you have your little elevator pitch. How important is an unusual and interesting elevator pitch if you're trying to sell something, especially if you're a brand new author who doesn't have any sort of background?
Yeah, well, so here's the thing. If, you know, it's called an elevator pitch for a reason. And if you don't have an agent yet, you know, conferences and pitch fests and those kinds of things are are a great way to get an agent. If you can get FaceTime with an agent, if you can become a human being instead of just a query letter, that's a huge advantage, and you don't want to waste it. And you don't want to waste their time. I will say, kind of on a broader level, synopses are really important too. And I know a lot of writers who,
I hate writing those.
Oh, they're terrible. Oh my God, I hate it. I hate it. And I remember I was devastated when I first got my first agent, and I was like, oh, thank God, now I don't have to write synopses anymore. And they're like, oh yeah, no, that's part of the pitch. And I was like, that they're going to send out to the editors. And I don't know if I actually cried, but I came pretty goddamn close, because it's just terrible. I remember I don't think it exists anymore, but Word, back in the olden days, had I think it was called auto summarize, and it was a button. It was a button you could click under tools, and it would like boil your 90,000 word manuscript down to like 1,200 words or something, and it was gibberish. It was gibberish. I actually once on a lark, I did it 3 times. So I brought it down to like 1,200 words, and then down to 200 words, and then down to 20 words, summarizing the summaries. And it was like this bizarre, surreal haiku of just like nonsense. But it was like, well, at least I don't have to do it, So I think it's a great exercise, because it helps you hone in on the essence of the work. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I struggled with as kind of a plot guy, it's like, as I said, I have my idea formation process tends to follow a certain path, but it usually starts with this nugget, and then just an idea, and then there's like a plot thing that comes off of it. Now, a lot of times, by the time you outline the whole thing out and then write the damn book, the most salient factor is not the first idea that you had,
Right.
And for me, it is really hard to get away from that. So writing, coming up with the pitch, writing the synopsis can really help you clarify in your mind, what is the nugget of the story as it's written, not as it was conceived, but as it is now. So I think it's hugely important if you're going to go to conferences, which I think is a great idea if you're trying to get an agent. If you're going to do, kind of any of these pitch fests, any like the speed dating with agents, which is, I know so many people who've gotten agents through that. But the last thing you want to do, if you have 1 minute to talk to this agent and you want to give them some time to talk to you, you don't want to sit down and not know what the hell you're talking about, not know what you're saying. So it is important. It is important.
Someone asked if there's a unique or a different way to get an agent for a YA book versus a traditional book. Is there something you should be doing when you're pitching it differently, other than saying, by the way, this is a YA book?
Yeah. I would say that, so I am a YA author, but I just finished a rewrite on my next book, which is an adult near future, science fiction. It's also very political. But then my next book after that is probably going to be another YA. The YA community. So, and the reason I bring that up is because, I think of myself as a writer, not just a YA, not just a YA writer. And, I have kind of become a part of the YA community, but it's a very, very, very vibrant community, and I am not at all as involved in it as as maybe I should be, as I could be. I kind of still have all my adult writer friends who I've known for 10, 15 years who I am, very close to. And, a lot of these things end up being, conferences, stuff like that, end up, they're social as much as anything else. After a while, you develop relationships with these people, and, you want to see them, you want to hang out with your people. that said, there is a very, very vibrant YA community. There's a lot of like teen book fests and YA conferences, and there's SCIBWE, the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and a lot of kind of places, a lot of a very, very vibrant blogging community. And so as far as that goes, I think that it would serve you well. If you're a YA writer and you're working on your first book and you're going to be going out there, if you can immerse yourself in that, that social circle, that social and professional, circle, one, you're going to learn a lot about the category and about how it works. And, and it is, there are a lot of differences between YA publishing and adult publishing. In ways, I think there's more differences in the publishing, the behind the scenes, than there is in the actual work itself.
But you still have to find the right agent or right editor for that, because not every editor and every agent will look at YA too. So you have to do your research.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are some who like just handle YA. And I will say that the at the risk of, and I don't want to go into I don't want this to get sidetracked, but the YA category has become very, very politicized. There's a lot of stuff going on, and some people think it's excessive, and some people think it's just wonderful, but it's important. It's important. There's a lot of there's a real commitment to social justice, and I think sometimes it's handled better than others. But I think for the most part, it's all really well intentioned and overdue, and it's important. It's important, important to the world. Not just important to the publishing industry or to individual writers' careers or whatever.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of YA now, but maybe not just now, where the theme is the adults have screwed up, we kids have to fix it. And even Harry Potter and also Hunger Games, like you mentioned, that's the theme. And I think it's encouraging young adults to get more involved in politics too, because they grew up reading this stuff.
Absolutely. And I think that's, that's like a natural, if you think of the young adult category, if you think about the fact that, it is supposed to be, adolescent centered and not, they should be driving the action, not reacting to what the grown-ups are doing, then you almost have to have a certain amount of, for whatever reason, the adults can't be trusted or can't do this, or they're not doing it or whatever. But I think, it's like, look around today, young people are driving change in this world. And I think that's, that's how it has been. I think that's how it should be, really, well, we shouldn't have screwed things up so bad. But I think that young people, that's part of what they do, is they try to make the world better. And I think, in a lot of ways they succeed, and the world ends up better because of it. I think one person, I'm not going to say who, but said that, I was at a conference with him, and he was bemoaning the fact, he thought that it was, that young adult had become more of a social movement than a publishing category. And I don't agree with that, but, I know where he's coming from. It is, the social justice and the politics is very, very important to it. And if you're not attuned to that, you should, as a good citizen, you should educate yourself anyway. But if you've been, hunkered in your room writing for the last 15 years and not really paying attention to, how the world has been changing or how it hasn't been and should be, then, you would do really, really well to get up to speed on that aspect of things.
We have a few more questions, a few more minutes. So if anyone else has any other questions, please type them up. Sue asks, what's the difference between young adult and coming of age novels? Or are they the same thing?
Well, I think it was said earlier, I think they can be the same thing. But if it's, so there are certain kind of definitional aspects of YA. And one of them is, as we were just talking about, is having, the cast of characters being, the vast majority of them being young adult. or adolescent, and having them driving the action and not just, kind of reacting to adults. But I think that a coming of age story that is written from the point of view of a middle-aged person looking back on their adolescence is not YA.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
A coming of age story written from the point of view of someone who is coming of age, that's very likely going to be YA. And again, it would, different people are going to expect different marks to be hit, of the, whatever they are, the amount of sexuality, the amount of language or violence or whatever, and the extent to which all the characters are young adult. Those things will have to be addressed as well. But I think that's I think that would be how I would answer that.
Do you consider Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, are those young adults, or are those someone's asking about those?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Or are they middle grade?
Oh. I mean, it's almost unanswerable because there was no young adult category back then.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's unanswerable.
Yeah,
at least by me.
Yeah, but also Diane Duane's "Do You Want to Be a Wizard" series, similar thing. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. Sort of the precursor for Harry Potter.
Right.
Which came out before there was a young adult category, really.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions anyone have? Someone says some examples of some young adult blogs, places where they can go to read up and see what agents are looking for. Anything else? Could you have any?
I'll say that there's my good friend Eric Smith is a literary agent and young adult author. He has a fairly new book out called "Don't Read the Comments," which is terrific. He has his previous book was also great. It's called "The Girl in the Grove." The father of the protagonist is known for really bad puns, and Eric says it quite broadly that he was based on me, which
sounds like I'd
awesome.
like it then. Yes.
Yeah. But he has a podcast called Hey YA, and I forget his co-host. I forget her name, but and I forget actually. I think it's Book Riot who puts it out, or maybe no. I think it's one of the publishers, one of the big publishers. But they do a great, it's a great kind of roundup of what's out and what's happening, and they talk about issues and they talk about books and they talk about just things that they face. And he's kind of he's really an authority. I think he's very wise and very knowledgeable, and very very attuned to what's going on in the world of YA. And I got to tell you, I hope I haven't misled anybody. I am not as much of a student of the industry as I should be. I'm not as I kind of like like Mayberry, my friend Joelle Charbonneau, who also writes YA. They're just like infinitely knowledgeable about what's going on in the industry, what's hot, what's not, what's evolving best practices, what agents and publishers are looking for, that sort of thing. And I mean, I'm fairly knowledgeable about it, but not anywhere near that.
How did you get an agent? Tell us your story.
Well, so I'll tell you, I'm on my third agent. Mm-hmm. Because we're such a pain in the ass to work with. No, I got my first agent from cold submission. So I wrote a novel, queried. I did for a couple of years, and went through a couple of rewrites and revisions. I did get a couple of offers of representation, but there was one thing. I guess there were 3 different agents. But they all had something that made me think, no, this isn't a good fit, which I never thought. I remember reading in like the writer's guide to, literary agents, and they're like, don't just, accept the first offer you get. And I would be like, oh shit, yes, I am, but sure enough, when I finally got these couple of offers, there were just a couple of things that set off the spidey sense. And I was like, yeah, this isn't a good fit. So I did sign with another agent. So I also by that point I was just finishing my second novel, and neither of those first two have ever been published. I did get an agent with the second one, just cold, sending it out cold, and she got me. So my first deal with Penguin, so she shopped it to Penguin Berkeley, and they said, well, this is really good, but it's not what we're looking for. Could you write a forensic series? So I said yes, because they're like, okay, they're going to publish it. And then I thought about writing forensics anyway. I knew it was kind of hot, and it was kind of in my wheelhouse a little bit. That kind of, that.
Are these the ones you did under a different name?
I did. It was D.H. Dublin was the pen
Right.
name. So I wrote those 3 books, and they did pretty well, for what they were, paperback originals, that under a pen name, that sort of thing. But I realized that my agent at the time, she was starting to work part-time. All of her deals were going back to the publishing imprint where she had been an editor, which was great because she had an in, but it was not so great.
She wasn't shopping it around like
she wasn't shopping. That's what it seemed like.
Yeah.
So we parted ways, and I signed with another agent who was at a very, very big New York agency, a very prominent agency. I remember going, and it was great. I had sent him a revision of my first book, and he loved it. And it was the craziest thing because he still represents a friend of mine. I pitched him, and he said, "Yeah, it sounds good. Send it." So I sent it. He called me the next day, and he said, "I'm only 100 pages into it, but I love it. I want to represent you." And I was like, "I am on my way." So he shopped it to the big 7, I guess it was at that point, and nobody bit. And he says, "Okay, what else do you have?" And I was like, "Well, what about the smaller, And he's like, "No, you don't want to, debut with them. You want to debut big," which, he might have been right about. I don't know. But I was like, okay, well, I had this idea, and I told him about the idea for Drift. And he said, okay, go write it, and, let me know when you're done. So I spent, 10 months maybe writing it, a year, I guess. And I sent it to him, and it was, it was a first draft, really. And he said to me, he says, "John, I love working with you. I love your other stuff, but this is not publishable. And there's nothing I can tell you to change about it that would make it publishable." And I was, I was gutted. But I was like, well, I signed with this big New York agent because he's supposed to know what he's talking about. And if that's what he says, but then I thought about it, and I'd had some of my, writer friends read it, and they all told me that it was really good. And I decided that even if he was right, if we saw things, well, and also it was like, there are ways to make it publishable. If it was not publishable, there would have been ways to make it publishable, and he should have known them and told them to me. But really for me, what it came down to was I decided that if we saw things that differently, then it wasn't a good fit.
No,
and so I started looking, and so a woman I know, I knew her as an editor at a couple of different publishing houses. And I knew her through the crime writing community, and so I'd met her at BoucherCon and NoirCon, and she had recently become an agent, and people were saying good things about her. And she was with Donald Moss agency at the time, so she was a friend, so we talked, and she said, yeah, it's really good, and she didn't say, "I'll represent you here, make these changes." She said, "Here, make these changes, and then I'll represent you. If you do a good job, basically." So that's what I did. Her editorial insights made perfect sense to me. A lot of them, I'd kind of been thinking about those directions anyway. And then we had 3 publishers bid on it.
All right. Well, that shows that it's not always easy. It doesn't happen to come quickly.
Well, and one thing I will say also is that, you have this sense published, aspiring writers have this idea that once they kind of break into it, once they get an agent and they get that first book published, that everything else they write is going to get published, and it's just going to be this kind of easy thing. And it's not. I know so many writers who have been like had success, like had like bestsellers, and then couldn't sell subsequent books, and then and then did sell subsequent books after that and did well again. Spliced, when I had the idea for Spliced, I was like, oh my God, this is brilliant. And my agent was really excited about it. But it took us 2 years. And what happened was, by the time I had finished writing it, the YA market had completely turned. So it was like glutted with like dystopian from the post Hunger Games, voracious pipeline filling publisher buying spree. And now everybody was, looking for the next John Green. And I was on the fence. I was considering self-publishing when the market started turning again, and they started looking at more, science fiction and fantasy and spec fiction and that sort of thing.
All right. Well, John, we've already run over our time. Thank you for very much. If you want to stick around, we're going to stop the recording now. So thank you, everyone. This is the Pocono Liars Club Zoom chat. And thank you, John McGoran. You can't hear everybody, but they're clapping. Yes.